In order to understand how we ended up here, we need to look at history. And there are, of course, written numerous books on development, cooperation, history, etc. And this is in no way an exhaustive presentation of that body of work. But just to highlight a couple of aspects, some would argue that development is now omnipresent. Governments, NGOs, the private sector, research, everyone is deeply involved in the discourse. And one literature review by Kunkel asks some fundamental questions regarding this history, such as what kind of ideas and assumptions have guided the development of this discourse over time. And he tries to describe the narrative from when development first became an operationalized concept towards the end of the 19th century, and increasingly so during the colonial period, when he says new technology and science, and in addition an increasing awareness of the fate concerning the fate of the indigenous people, that combined gave rise to what is called developmentalism. However, everything was still, of course, defined and controlled by Western powers. And many writers have underlined that there are a number of continuities. There are continuities between the colonial time and the post-colonial time and modern development cooperation. For example, you had colonial experts that just stayed on in countries after independence. They stayed on as consultants, or they reinvented themselves and moved into the sort of newly established UN system. So interestingly, many argue that it's first with the SDGs that the old Western powers, their bureaucracies and their experts are actually losing control of the development agenda. And this is allowed to happen both because of the geopolitical dynamic that many have labeled the rise of the rest, for example, and the stagnation of the West, but also because the specific format that the SDGs were developed within, and the so-called open working group, was able to move the discussion from a highly politicized process to a highly technocratic process. Another interesting historic trend which culminates with the SDGs is that constant expansion of issues and projects under the umbrella of development, sometimes referred to as inflated expectations. And this may be because of the importance of institutions. Policymaking theory underline the fact that new policies and new problems, which are being recognized, often create new institutions that really die hard. So although the world changes, most development institutions are, as Kunkel says, they are adamantly opposed to becoming oblivious. And relatedly, another historian, Carol Lancaster, she noted that an important driver of the increase of aid during the 1970s was that aid had developed its own constituencies domestically, which primarily consisted of bureaucrats, politicians, and NGOs. Thus, as the policy area of aid emerged and took hold, institutions and constituencies domestically co-evolved. And as such, in our quest to understand why policymakers tend to adopt all these ambitious commitments, a part of the answer lies in existing institutions and constituencies who have developed some kind of a policy monopoly on issues related to aid, sustainable development, and international development cooperation. A normal way of establishing so-called policy monopolies is to sort of confine issues and policies within the expert's domain. In this way, one can shield the policy area from the general public's attention and reduce conflicting views by framing the policy discourse according to the worldview of the dominant expertise. And regarding the SDGs, this theoretical insight is quite interesting because the development era historically has been a history of competing visions of modernity and a lot of conflict. But with the SDGs, this perspective and this hallmark does not seem to be as dominant anymore. The lack of ideological conflict and political conflict is actually noticeable. So either it's because it's completely depoliticized, or because it's so wide and vague enough to encompass all kinds of visions for modernity. So this will bring us into the next part of my talk, which is adoption versus implementation.